Hello, my friends. Something exciting awaits. Pay attention to these two figures, frozen in the grainy footage of a private security camera. The man, visibly tense, his hands jammed into the pockets of his worn work jacket, is Mark Jensen, a 52-year-old carpenter. The man opposite him, holding a dog leash and a phone, is Richard Price, a 48-year-old senior partner at a prestigious Los Angeles law firm. Little did Richard know these were the final moments of his life. A few seconds later, right there on the pristine tree-lined sidewalk of his Brentwood neighborhood, the man in the jacket would change the trajectory of both their lives forever. At 6:17 a.m. on March 4, 2003, the LAPD's 911 dispatch center received a frantic call. A neighbor, his voice cracking with panic, reported hearing two sharp cracks like planks of wood snapping. Through his panicked breaths, he described seeing a man in expensive athletic wear lying motionless on the pavement, his golden retriever barking beside him. He also saw the shooter, a second man who didn't run or speed away. He simply lowered the rifle, turned, and walked away from the scene with a calm, deliberate pace. Police units raced to the location, preparing for a dangerous manhunt in the quiet, winding streets. But the suspect wasn't hiding, and the pursuit they expected never happened. Instead, what they found waiting for them was somehow far more unsettling. Richard Price was, by every public measure, a titan. At 48, he was a newly named partner at Price, Donahue & Taft, earning an annual salary well into the seven figures. His colleagues and rivals alike praised his surgical precision in the courtroom, pointing to an unbroken streak of victories for the firm's high-profile corporate clients. He had built a pristine reputation from a prestigious education at Yale Law and a background rooted in East Coast old money. His life outside the courtroom reflected this success: a $4.2 million minimalist mansion, a silver Porsche 911, and a social calendar filled with the city's political and financial elite. Divorced with no children, his life was his career. However, beneath this polished surface was a well-documented professional flaw, one his firm celebrated as a winning strategy. Hospital records and patient reviews had defined Dr. Holloway's flaw. For Richard Price, it was court transcripts and deposition tapes. While powerful CEOs and board members received his full charismatic attention, those on the other side of the table, plaintiffs, small business owners, or whistleblowers, reported a different experience. They described Price as cold, dehumanizing, and contemptuous. Depositions were treated not as fact-finding missions, but as psychological warfare. Questions were brushed aside, personal attacks were levied with a bored expression, and a clear sense of irritation was noted by opposing counsel if proceedings were delayed. This wasn't just an aggressive legal tactic. It was a consistent bias that separated his opponents by their perceived power. His world of precision and privilege was orderly and sterile, far removed from the lives of the working-class families who sometimes ended up in his crosshairs. In late 2001, that sterile world was about to collide with a family who had nothing but each other when a whistleblower case file for a 29-year-old engineer named David Jensen landed on his desk. Mark Jensen's world revolved around his brother. At 52, Mark was a quiet, hard-working carpenter who had already endured significant loss. After his wife died of cancer a decade earlier, his 29-year-old brother, David, became the sole focus of his life. Mark had practically raised David after their parents died young. David, an idealistic and brilliant software engineer, had worked for 3 years at Aperture Dynamics, a major tech conglomerate. When David discovered a catastrophic flaw in a new smart grid system, a flaw he calculated could lead to widespread blackouts and fires, he dedicated himself to getting it fixed. He reported it internally, sending memo after memo. He was told by his superiors to stand down and that his projections were alarmist. When he was removed from the project, he did what he thought was right. He compiled his data and sent it to a federal regulator, becoming a whistleblower. Aperture's response was immediate and brutal. They fired him and filed a $5 million civil suit for theft of intellectual property and breach of contract. Their lead attorney was Richard Price. On April 12, 2002, Mark and David sat in the sterile 40th floor conference room of Price, Donahue and Taft for David's deposition. According to Mark's later statements, he watched Richard Price spend nearly 30 minutes with his corporate team, laughing and joking about a golf game. When David and his court-appointed lawyer were finally called in, the atmosphere changed instantly. The deposition lasted 7 hours. Price barely made eye contact with David, directing his highly technical attacks at David's credibility, not his data. When David tried to ask for a clarification, the attorney appeared visibly irritated. Mark's questions about the data's validity were met with a curt, dismissive response from Price. "Your brother is a disgruntled employee, Mr. Jensen, not a scientist. He's here because he stole from my client." Before they could process what was happening, the meeting was over, and Price was handing a new motion to their lawyer, this one accusing David of perjury. Mark left that office with a growing sense of terror. He had witnessed a clear difference in the standard of justice, a difference based on their bank account. He saw a lawyer who viewed his brother not as a person but as a liability to be erased. On the morning of June 19, 2002, David Jensen was scheduled for a summary judgment hearing. Richard Price, meanwhile, arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes late, his tan indicating a recent vacation. The hearing was short. Price argued that David's whistleblower protection was invalid due to a technicality. He had allegedly used a company computer to email the regulator, a violation of his employment agreement. The judge, citing a recent precedent, agreed. David's case was dismissed. The $5 million countersuit, however, was allowed to proceed. At 4:32 p.m., the legal team discovered the devastating consequences. After hearing the news, David Jensen had gone back to his small apartment, written a short note, and hanged himself. 30 minutes later, Mark Jensen, who had been trying to call his brother all afternoon, arrived at the apartment and found him. He sat with his brother's body for an hour before he could call 911. The note left open on the laptop was clinical and showed no hope. He won. He proved I was nothing. He took my work, he took my name, and now he'll take your house. I'm sorry, Mark. In the weeks following his brother's death, Mark Jensen was consumed by a grief that was black and total. His small house in Van Nuys became a silent memorial to the only family he had left. The isolation was shattered when a registered letter arrived from Price, Donahue and Taft. It was not a letter of condolence. It was a cold, formal notice that, as David's next of kin, he was now responsible for the $87,000 in legal fees Aperture had been awarded in their countersuit. Staring at the cold demand for payment for the legal battle that killed his brother, Mark's grief began to harden into suspicion. He called Richard Price's office 19 times over the next few weeks, not to threaten, but to beg for a meeting, to show him the data, to make him understand what David had been trying to prevent. His calls were never returned. Frustrated and stonewalled, Mark used what little money he had to hire a legal aid attorney, Sarah Fine, to file a wrongful death suit based on intentional infliction of emotional distress. Fine immediately requested the complete unedited case file from Aperture, including all internal memos regarding the smart grid flaw. She then sent the entire file to an independent engineering consultant with a reputation for blunt, unbiased reviews. For weeks, Mark waited, hoping for an answer that would either confirm his fears or allow him to finally let go. The answer arrived on September 14, 2002, in the form of the consultant's official report. The findings were not ambiguous, they were damning. The consultant stated in clear and unequivocal terms that David Jensen's data was 100% accurate, and that Aperture's internal memos showed they were aware of the flaw at least 6 months before they fired David. He concluded that David's death was a direct result of a corporate cover-up and a campaign of malicious prosecution. For Mark, this report was everything. It was proof that his brother's death wasn't just an unfortunate tragedy, it was a fatal, inexcusable silencing. Armed with the expert's report, Mark's attorney filed the suit against Richard Price and Aperture Dynamics on October 1st. The response was immediate and aggressive. Price's legal team filed a motion to dismiss, claiming David's death was an unfortunate independent act and that Price's legal tactics were protected speech. Throughout the fall, Mark sat through hearings, watching as Richard Price in his expensive designer suits showed no remorse. During his own deposition in November, he stated coldly that his representation was to the standard of care and that the outcome, while unfortunate, was not his responsibility. The legal system that Mark had put his faith in began to systematically dismantle his case. The firm's lawyers buried him in paperwork. The final blow came on December 20th when a judge dismissed the consultant's expert testimony based on a legal technicality. The consultant had previously worked for a subsidiary of Aperture's parent company, rendering him biased. Mark's lawyer informed him that their chances of winning had plummeted to zero. Feeling defeated and financially drained, Mark was forced to drop the suit. Aperture's lawyers then made a final offer. They would generously agree to waive the $87,000 in legal fees he owed on one condition. Mark had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and legally agree that no wrongdoing had occurred on the part of Aperture Dynamics or its legal counsel. Mark left the lawyer's office with no justice, no accountability, and no closure. The system had delivered its final insulting verdict. The failed lawsuit was the breaking point. With no legal recourse left, Mark Jensen spiraled into a deep and isolating depression. He stopped going to work, losing his carpentry business. His small house went into foreclosure, and he began living out of his 1998 Ford F-150. The truck became a dark cab filled with his brother's photographs, stacks of legal documents, and newspaper clippings about corporate corruption. He stopped interacting with friends and spent his days consumed by a singular burning obsession: Richard Price. Price's life, unlike his, had continued without interruption. In January 2003, he was officially made a named partner at his firm. Driven by a feeling of profound powerlessness, Mark began driving his truck to Brentwood. He would park for hours, watching Price's expensive home from a distance. He saw him leave for his exclusive golf club, return with shopping bags, and host dinner parties. To Mark, every light on in that house was a symbol of the injustice he had suffered. He was watching a man who had, in his eyes, taken a life without consequence, and the legal system had rewarded him for it. His grief curdled into a cold, methodical anger. On February 10, 2003, that anger took a concrete form. Mark drove to a pawn shop in the valley. He had an old hunting rifle, but he wanted something else. With no criminal history or mental health holds on his record, his background check cleared. He legally purchased a Mossberg 500 shotgun and several boxes of shells, telling the clerk he wanted it for coyote protection on a job site. He left the store with the weapon in a box. He was no longer just watching. He was now preparing. The purchase of the gun was the final turning point. In the weeks that followed, Mark Jensen's actions became methodical and precise. He took the shotgun to a remote area in the desert, familiarizing himself with the weight, recoil, and spread of the weapon. His surveillance of Richard Price also intensified, shifting from aimless observation to data collection. He documented Price's daily schedule in a small notebook. Walks dog at 6:15 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, gets coffee at 6:30 a.m. Housekeeper comes on Mondays, home by 8 p.m. By March 3, 2003, his plan was fully formed. That evening, he sat in the cab of his truck and wrote 2 letters. The first was a 10-page detailed account of his brother's discovery, the corporate cover-up, the brutal legal tactics, and the systemic indifference that had pushed him to this point. He addressed it simply to the Los Angeles Times. The second letter was shorter, written to the only person he felt would understand. It was a note to his brother. In it, he wrote, "David, I'm sorry, but I can't let him get away with what he did to you. He didn't care that you died. He didn't care about the truth at all. I have to make this right." He placed the letters on his passenger seat, his preparations now complete. On the morning of Tuesday, March 4, 2003, Mark Jensen parked his truck 3 blocks from Richard Price's home and walked the remaining distance in the pre-dawn quiet, the shortened shotgun concealed in his long jacket. He waited. At 6:14 a.m., just as his notebook predicted, Price exited his home, dressed in running clothes, his golden retriever pulling at its leash. Mark stepped out from behind a row of hedges to confront him. According to witness statements and Mark's own confession, Price was initially annoyed, not recognizing him, fumbling for his phone. "Can I help you?" When Mark identified himself, "I'm Mark Jensen." David Jensen's brother, his annoyance turned to cold dismissiveness. "The matter is settled," Price said, his voice hard. "You are harassing me. I'm calling the police." That cold dismissal was the final trigger. As Richard Price turned his back on him to start his walk, a final act of disregard, Mark pulled out the shotgun. For the first time, Price saw the weapon, and his irritation was replaced by sheer terror. The neighbor's security camera captured the next 30 seconds, Price backing away, his hands raised, pleading for his life. Witnesses later reported hearing him offer him money. Wait, you want money? I can get you money, a lot of money." A final, fatal miscalculation of the man he was facing. For Mark, this was not about money. It was about a life that had been devalued. At 6:17 a.m., Mark Jensen fired twice. The blasts echoed through the silent, wealthy canyon. Richard Price collapsed on the sidewalk. For a moment, Mark stood over his body, his expression later described by a witness as simply empty. As a neighbor across the street screamed into a 911 call, he turned and walked, not ran, back the way he came, leaving the star attorney to die on the perfect green grass of the life he had built. While paramedics pronounced Richard Price dead at 6:28 a.m., police located Mark's truck just 3 blocks away. They found him sitting calmly in the driver's seat, the shotgun resting on the passenger seat next to the letters. He surrendered without any resistance, putting his hands out the window before they could even issue a command. His first words to the arresting officers were direct and without emotion. "I did it. I killed him. He murdered my brother and nobody cared." For the lead homicide detective, Maria Ramirez, the case seemed to be the simplest she had handled in years. They had video evidence, multiple eyewitnesses, a murder weapon, and a suspect who had already given a full confession. But that afternoon, Detective Ramirez executed a search warrant on Mark's truck. On the passenger seat, she found the 10-page letter. She sat in her car and read all of it. It was not the rambling manifesto of a madman. It was a methodical, heartbreakingly detailed account of his brother's whistleblower case, the corporate cover-up, the cold dismissal by the legal system, and the crushing weight of a justice system that he felt had ignored him. Ramirez was a veteran detective who had seen countless motives for murder, but this was different. The letter didn't excuse the crime, but it explained it with a painful clarity. The open and shut case now had a deep and troubling context. The man in her custody was a killer. But as Ramirez finished the last page, she began to wonder if he was also a victim. Mark Jensen's trial in October 2003 captured the attention of Los Angeles, becoming a flashpoint for public debate on corporate power and where justice truly lies. The prosecution painted the picture of a man who appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, presenting a clear timeline of premeditation, the surveillance, the gun purchase, and the letters. In response, his public defender argued it was a case of voluntary manslaughter, telling the story of a grieving brother pushed past his breaking point by a negligent and malicious lawyer and a system that had utterly failed him. Evidence of the Aperture cover-up and the damning expert report on David's data were laid bare for the jury to see. Against his lawyer's advice, Mark himself testified. He was honest and raw, admitting his crime was wrong, but refusing to apologize for the anger that fueled it. "My brother died because a lawyer didn't think he was important enough to listen to," he told the silent courtroom. "He was just a problem to be erased. I know I have to pay, but I want you to understand, my brother's life mattered." After 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that satisfied no one, guilty of second-degree murder. They acknowledged the emotional provocation but could not condone the act. The judge sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison. In the years that followed, the case left a complicated and tragic legacy. Richard Price's death, combined with the evidence from the trial, triggered a federal investigation into Aperture Dynamics. The company quietly recalled the smart grid system, and 2 of its executives were indicted for fraud. Price's law firm, facing intense public scrutiny, revised its internal ethics policies and quietly settled 2 other aggressive defense lawsuits. The case itself became a local symbol of the deep flaws in the justice system, a chilling example of how easily individuals can be failed by the very institutions designed to protect them. Vincent Calabrese was a model prisoner. After being denied parole twice, Mark Jensen was finally released in May 2025 at 74 years old. Having served 22 years, he now volunteers at a legal aid clinic, the same one that had tried to help him, counseling families of whistleblowers, helping them navigate the same system that broke him.